This is Rob with Federal Finance CPE, and today I'm going to talk about a subject that all of us in internal controls are going to deal with. It's selecting samples for our internal controls testing. This happens during our test of operating effectiveness in the assessment. I'm going to first start off by just defining what a sample is, why we do it, and then I'm going to go into the tables that we use to select our sample size. So if you hang on, by the end, you should be confident that you're selecting the appropriate sample size for the type of control you have. But we first start off, what is sampling and why do we do it? Well, for one, sampling allows us to select some of a population, not 100%, and come to a conclusion on the overall population. So for controls testing, for example, we don't usually select every instance of a control operating. We select a sample and then we make our judgments on whether that control is operating effectively throughout the period based on that sample. And when I say effectively, what I really mean is the control doing what it should be doing, and are those operating controls doing it the same every time? For example, is every contract signed by a warranted contract officer? You might ask why, some people might say, why can't we just test everything? Well, it's going to come down to, honestly, probably time and money. Could you test everything with unlimited time and money? Yes, you could. But that's not the world we live in. You do this to be efficient. Maybe it's your payroll control. Maybe it's your timesheets, approving time. That happens multiple times a month by multiple people in your organization. Is it realistic to test every single one of those? No. And remember, we're providing reasonable assurance in our internal controls assessment, not absolute assurance. There's a big difference. That's why we use sampling. So now we go into how do we select samples? What's the sample size we use? Well, before I go into the sample size, I need to talk about one thing, and that is your sample population. Now, in an OMB A-123, what we really focus on is how often a control happens. Is it an annual control? Is it a monthly control? Is it a daily control, or just a recurring high volume control? Now, that is your population, your control. It's the instance of your control operating. So when I say it's a monthly control, what I'm really meaning is that control operates 12 times. If it's a weekly, 52 controls, right? If it's daily, 365, right? Or it's recurring, so you're going to have multiple, it could have many times a day. Now, I want this to be very clear. Think about instances, not necessarily how often it occurs, because while there are controls that operate once a month, overall, there are some controls that the control itself, as we describe it, maybe it's a accountant verifying a fund. Maybe they do that on a monthly basis. But I would challenge you to say that's not a monthly control, because very few entities are going to have one fund. They're going to have multiple funds. So let's say you have 5 funds. If you did this on a monthly basis, you'd actually have 60 instances, right, of this occurring, because you have 5 funds, 12 months, 60 controls. Instances. I just want you to know that, because you really need to think of the control frequency in terms of how often is this control operating, so that'll get you to the right sample size. All right, so now they talked about the population. Once you know the population, then you can go over to this sample size suggestion. Now, I've been at a few agencies and supported the A-123 program. All of them, without an exception, really refer to the sampling table and sample size selection that's in the OMB A-123 implementation guide. And it's this guide. It's pretty simple. I have a table and it shows you annual controls, you have 1 sample. It's pretty straightforward. Quarterly controls, you have 2. Monthly controls, you can have 3 samples. Weekly, 10. Daily, 30. And then those high volume recurring controls, 45. Now these are your suggested samples. So I would say you could always add more if you want to be conservative, and we usually are in this world. You can add more samples for the size. Or what's really common is you'll have a control that operates. Maybe it's not a very rigid into one of these time frames, but it falls in between one another. Maybe it is it happens 20 times a year. So it's not quite, it's definitely not a monthly, but not a weekly. I would always defer to going to the larger sample size. So in that case, when it's midway between monthly and weekly, I would go with a weekly control size. This is just, it's a little bit of a more conservative option, but I think it's a safer bet and it's going to give you better coverage, right? So, now we talked about the sample size tables. What I want to talk about is some just, applying this guidance in practice. What I want you to always remember is document the rationale for your sample size selection. It might feel silly if your control is very obviously a annual control, right? But in this world of A-123, documenting why, like, hey, I chose the annual control because it operates once a year. That, to me, that would be appropriate, and you'd get there. What it starts getting, I think, more tricky and more useful is when you start going into those in between sample sizes, or when you have a control that maybe, it does operate, once a month they do it, but it's operated for every fund individually as opposed to just one time a month. That way it's very clear that you're getting your population size. As you notice, I've talked about this population size a few times. That's where I find actually most of the errors I've seen or, misjudgments have taken, because the person who's doing the actual sampling doesn't really know what the population size is. They're taking some estimates and guesses, but they don't know, which is still important because while, you start your sampling, you make your plan, you start your sampling, by the end of the year, you do need to reassess to make sure that your assumptions are the same because, with the exception of, I would always say, those monthly recurring controls where you kind of know exactly what you're going to be doing, you can figure it out. If it's an ad hoc or a control that doesn't operate to like a calendar schedule, you might not know exactly how big the population is. And you need to make sure you sampled appropriately by year end. My takeaway is use that table to choose your sample size, but really know your population. Figure out how many instances of that control operates, right? Not is it a monthly control, it's how many times it kicks. Or, for those controls that are just recurring, just figuring out how often does it operate. Be able to get that population. You're going to need that to know that definitive population size when you actually do your samples. So you still, give everybody an opportunity to be selected. But that's a discussion for another day. Think of sampling as like a spotlight, right? You're lighting up the room partially. You're not using a floodlight and showing the entire room. You're just looking at parts of it. So you're looking systematically in different areas to see if you see any deviations. That's why it's important when you do select your samples for it to be a representative of the entire population, so you can confidently say you have reasonable assurance of that control operating throughout the period.